So yeah, I was really interested to read this essay, and I was thinking about ways that we could get into talking about it. And I know that there are people who are watching from various places, as we just established, who have different levels of background, kind of familiarity with some of this literature and some of the debates that you're intervening in here. So I thought one kind of straightforward way of getting into it would be to start by talking a little bit about the view that you are disagreeing with, that the sort of that I mean, obviously there's this sort of larger cultural idea that equality of opportunity is a particularly important kind of equality, but there's also a philosophical articulation that includes, people, figures like J. Cohen, who we're both interested in, that is called luck egalitarianism. That's part of what you're criticizing in this essay. So do you want to just kind of start us off a little bit about what the luck egalitarians say before we get into why you think they're wrong?
Sure. Thanks a lot, Ben. Thanks very much for doing this. And thank you to the Philosopher and Anthony and Boston Review and Matt Lord for putting this together. It's wonderful to talk about these really important questions. Well, I guess it's fair enough to say that liberal democratic capitalist societies are all united by a commitment to the idea that individuals should be treated with equal respect. Sure, there's racism and discrimination around, but in general, it's not really respectable to articulate those in most forums. So we have this conviction that people should be treated with equal respect. And then the question is, how does that play out in various domains? And in particular, the domain of opportunities and positions and people's socioeconomic situation. And their liberal democratic capitalist societies tend to be described as being founded on the principle of equality of opportunity. And by that, we mean that, well, at a minimum, people should be able to pursue their goals without encountering discrimination or bigotry or prejudice. So opportunities and positions should be open to people without those kinds of barriers. But obviously, that's a fairly modest demand to make of equality of opportunity, that you're not ruled out just because of your skin color, for example. So liberal egalitarians have wanted to go further and elaborate the equality of opportunity idea a little bit more, to think about ways in which people can, in a sense, be not really at the same starting line due to differences in educational status, family background, and other kinds of social ingredients that mean that some people are worse off compared to others through no fault of their own. So that more elaborate and more substantive idea of equality of opportunity is what thinkers like John Rawls and Ronald Dworkin, for example, who are, probably the two of the most well-known liberal egalitarians, have articulated. But that liberal egalitarian view could nonetheless be thought of as potentially a kind of no strings attached idea. And so some people have wanted to say, well, if we really take equality of opportunity seriously and thinking that what we want to remove are those arbitrary obstacles, what about obstacles that aren't so arbitrary? So in that case, maybe we want to say that some people have disadvantages that are the result of circumstances beyond their control, but other people have disadvantages that are the result of choice or decisions that they've made. And that justice requires that we remedy the first kind of disadvantage, but not the second. So people have taken the view that equality of opportunity really dictates this luck egalitarian view, where we want to say that people's disadvantages, which are the result of bad brute luck, are unjust, but people whose disadvantages are the result of choices or decisions that they made, gambles or imprudent elections in terms of how to run their lives, those are things that we don't think are appropriately justly remedied.
Yeah,
that's in a sense the foundational canonical view in mainstream liberal egalitarianism.
right. And I should say that something you mentioned briefly in your essay, but is that there is, so there's the sort of left liberal version of something like egalitarianism, where you're only sort of what you're worried about remedying are social disadvantages, those kinds of factors that you just mentioned, educational status, family background, um, and but there's also a sort of deeper kind of luck egalitarianism, where you say, well, the unchosen disadvantages that are also inside your own head are also relevant. That if that the that if I had done or inside your own skin, at least, right? If I had done nothing all day every day but practice basketball, I would probably not have a future in the NBA. If I'd done this from a very early age and I had great coaches, not everybody started has the same physical starting points. Not everybody, if people, and also maybe more relevantly, the sort of cognitive advantages that lead people to test well, or have and be better at retaining certain kinds of information, or have like are in 1,000 ways advantageous for like climbing the career ladder of the professional managerial class to get out of poverty in advanced capitalist democracies, are the kinds of things that are themselves, as like some like egalitarians have recognized, not up to you. It's maybe up to you how much you develop these advantages, but it's not up to you what your starting point is, or how you have them, right? So I mean that is, I guess I just wanted to push that a little bit before we get to your criticisms, because I think that there is one way of sort of that's maybe contained in this, of sort of saying there are kind of more radical resources within this view for criticizing more kinds of equality than people might think, because when we hear the phrase equality of opportunity, we have a certain set of cultural and political associations with that. But if there is a way of thinking about equality of opportunity that would say, no, even we should find even inequalities that come from your own your own internal capacities problematic, because I mean, obviously some philosophers would say nothing is up to you, but but even if some things are up to you, those aren't.
Yeah, well, sure. The scope of what we decide is a matter of luck or circumstance, or the kinds of contingencies over which one doesn't have control might be very large. So a left-wing luck egalitarian might say, look, I invoke luck to point out how much of inequality and disadvantage is the result of bad brute luck, and how little is the result of choice. So that is true. But I guess I wonder, why play into that right-wing discourse at all? Why think of there as sort of being a queue and you take some people out of the queue for the remedy of disadvantage if they don't meet that bar of being not being responsible for their disadvantage. And I guess I think that choice and decision making is just so mired in circumstance. How prudent people are, for example, how confident they are, how resourceful they are. So even our choice-making capacities could be argued as in the domain of circumstance. And so I would think that if we want to attend to the really grave inequalities in our world, we have to look at outcomes. How are people doing? What lot do they have in life? What are they flourishing? Do they have well-being? And I think that's really just going back to that famous mantra from Karl Marx that, from each according to their ability and to each according to their need. And so we want to make sure that people's needs are met. And I think this invoking of responsibility and choice, prudent decision-making and so forth, is just unhelpful, even if it may be that the left-wing luck egalitarians and I end up agreeing on what policies to adopt and so forth, I think that we should avoid this kind of responsibility talk. And it's interesting. I mean, I was really taken aback that Jerry Cohen, who left wing on all kinds of fronts, applauded Ronald Dworkin for in coming up with this circumstance versus choice distinction, and said, hooray, you've helped yourself to this right-wing idea of choice and responsibility and brought it into the egalitarian fold. This is a great service. And I thought, no, it is not a great service. This is unfortunate. Now, of course, if you might think that this is politically valuable, but I think in some ways the academy is a little bit too squeamish and timid on these issues. I mean, even in the real world of liberal egalitarian politics, which God knows is not egalitarian enough, there's much more preparedness to hand out, if you like, the remedy to one's disadvantage with no questions asked. So think of socialized medicine, for example. It is not the case that when you end up in the emergency department, you're asked, why is it that you have a broken arm? Were you in a car accident, or did you get drunk and jump off a roof? No one asked that question. Rather, your healthcare is just provided. It's not even triaged. It's just the way we think that needs should be met. Now, like egalitarians might say, oh, well, wait a minute, there's certain things that, yeah, those are too important to be at the mercy of this choice circumstance distinction. But then I guess I just start to wonder why if you start to pile on these qualifications, maybe the theory is actually not doing much work for you and it's best abandoned.
I wonder, because I would imagine that in your example about universal healthcare, my guess would be that not only the vast majority of people who support it, which is, I guess, where you are, even conservatives have to at least sort of pretend to, but even the vast majority of at least vaguely left-wing people who support it probably do take it for granted that there is a distinction between the kinds of goods that should just be a baseline for everybody. That healthcare would certainly be in, or like, I don't know, K-12 public education would certainly be in, some of us think higher education should be in, et cetera, that everybody, that everybody should just get as that it's like unreasonable or unjust to deny anybody these things for any reason. But they don't really start from the view that everything goes in that basket, or at least, everything can't be in that basket, limited resources, whatever, but at least an equal quantity of everything is in that basket. And so I wonder if one way to take Cohen's point about Dworkin is to say that these are incredibly widely and deeply held intuitions that responsibility and choice matter in some way, that it's not that at the very least there's something that's like especially outrageous about inequalities over which you have no control, and that it's that it could be seen as a service, both just in service of the truth, if we think that there's something to this intuition, and certainly politically a service if you're trying to show how ideals widely held by your adversaries would actually lead to your conclusion. That to say, no, this is something that actually, if you take this really seriously, you need incredibly deep redistribution, or it's probably just not compatible with with capitalist property relations, which is, honestly, I've always thought, so Cohen makes this distinction between bourgeois equality of opportunity, which is just like You can't, you can't have laws saying that if, that like people of a certain skin color can't have certain opportunities or whatever. Left liberal equality of opportunity, which is no social disadvantages, and what he calls socialist equality of opportunity, which is also no disadvantages, unchosen disadvantages within your head, messing with the distribution. But I've always wondered if even the left liberal equality of opportunity, I mean, that's taken really seriously. I mean, like could you reconcile that with capitalist property relations? That even if there are various things that left liberals who accept capitalism would support doing to try to rectify that to a certain extent, but ultimately, I mean, if you have things like inheritance rights, it's really hard not to see how you're going to get large distributive inequalities that are tethered to factors outside of your control, even in that sense, right? Even in that social sense. So I guess I'm wondering, from you, like if you think, I guess what you would think about both halves of that, right? So one is whether there is something useful about appealing to intuitions that are widely held, even by, I mean, I think we can even take conservatives out of it, even by like sort of nice social democrats who think that, like, of course, we should have universal health care, that there is something that's, that like some goods everybody has a right to, others, others we need these other principles to sort of figure out. And then the other half would be, even if you think, I mean, clearly you do, right? And this is what you make your case for in your excellent essay, but like, even if you think that other kinds of inequality matter, is there anything to that idea that there's something sort of particularly outrageous about inequalities that people have no control over because they're tied to factors over outside of their control?
Yeah, I guess though, I think that when it comes right down to it, looks like that basically is the problem of inequality in general. I don't think it's very helpful to say, but there's this little tiny package of disadvantage that's the result of, foolish decision making, and it's down on you. I mean, if you want to play that game in the real world, and of course, people like Cohen say sometimes you have to do kind of crappy things in the real world to make some political gains, even though it's a compromise to the principles that you think are important. Maybe that's true, but actually I'm not so sure. I mean, I think if someone said to you, should you have an equal opportunity to this, something that's really important to your well-being, or should you have the thing that's really important to your well-being? I think we probably actually think this equal opportunity idea is fairly abstract and obscure, actually, for a lot of ordinary people. But people say it as a mantra because they're told that, equality of outcome, there lies the Soviet communism. But I don't, if you actually put the question to them, I think they find it a little strange that you're going to have this sort of filter or this test that has to be met. And I guess another thing is that the egalitarian ideal involves relations of solidarity and community, which I think really pulls against this way of understanding equality of opportunity and like egalitarianism, even on these more generous progressive versions. And indeed, Cohen, in the essay that's behind you there, actually confesses that he's a little uneasy about the tension he sees between the principle of community and the sort of what he thinks of as justice-based ideas that, if it's your fault, it's on you. And he has this wonderful example of a socialist camping trip, right, where all the campers come and share their resources. Well, thinking about the real world and camping trips, it often is one of the campers comes and they're clueless. They haven't brought any equipment. They don't know how, they sleep in instead of getting up to get on with the tasks of the day and so forth. People have conversations with that person saying, hey, come on, pitch in. But they don't say, okay, you're not in the tent because you forgot to bring one, or we just think that there's this kind of collective enterprise that we're all committed to, and that only goes well for all of us if we see the well-being of every member as important. And I think that ideal is too easily lost. And again, it's thought of, oh, well, isn't that just a kind of icing on the cake, not really what's important. But I think that material deprivation has among its wrongs the impact on our social relations. And so we really need to think more broadly about the term I use as human flourishing, as what we are trying to make people equal in. And when we think along those lines, we might think that living a life that's characterized by imprudent decision-making means you're less likely to flourish. It's much better to be self-determining, responsible, and so forth. But that's not the basis for a kind of punitive approach where you're denied resources because you're imprudent. It's rather to think of a life well lived as a life where one takes responsibility and so forth. But mainly what makes a life characterized by flourishing or well-being is to have those good outcomes, to have your life going well, and rather than the opportunity for it to go well. And so I think that preoccupation that liberal egalitarians also have, which is to the means to whatever ends one might want to pursue, is also handicapping the egalitarian discourse in ways that are unhelpful. And sort of mean-spirited and kind of grudging, which is just sort of contrary to the whole egalitarian ideal.
Got it. Well, obviously we could keep talking about this part for a very long time, and I would enjoy that. But I do want to make sure that the time that we have, that we kind of cover the other half of the topic. So you kind of took us there at the end of your last comments. But since the larger topic is essentially, well, it's the one that a lot of the classic, I think there are like at least 2 or 3 of the classic essays about this are called like equality of what, right? And so
Yeah.
we've been talking about your criticisms of one very popular answer to that, which is equality of opportunity. And I want to get into your own positive view. So you've already used the word flourishing, which is what you think that we should be aiming at equalizing, that everybody's living equally flourishing lives. So I mean, this is obviously, as our host said at the beginning, a certain species of equality of outcome. But I mean, what's the I do want to drill into this a little bit philosophically. So I mean, like what does flourishing mean to you? I mean, this is like a like that's clearly some sort of positive outcome. But I mean, what sort are we talking about, and how do we decide?
Thanks, Ben. Well, I mean, I have my own particular sense of what that is, but I think it's the kind of thing that probably we would want to negotiate and elaborate, and which would evolve and change. But it does have what's often called a perfectionist dimension, which is some idea of objectively valuable pursuits. And I think tied with that is realizing your potential, making the most of your capacities, and doing things and pursuing things and enjoying things and engaging in things that are actually worth doing. So that's one dimension. And another is a self-determining autonomy type dimension. And then I think one has to give a nod to hedonistic type considerations of finding contentment. Now, I don't have it worked out in terms of the weight given to these various things, but that's what I think is the way we ought to think of flourishing. And so it would involve a lot of different kinds of considerations, socioeconomic considerations of the kind that egalitarians usually talk about in terms of income and wealth, but also more specifically housing, nourishment, healthcare, the things that keep the bodily self going and going well. Things like education as well, and leisure activities, access to nature, and so forth. And also, I think issues of alienation, loneliness, isolation, those are things that are hugely important in terms of whether one thinks one's life is going well. So I think a political community has to attend to those other ways in which we don't flourish. And actually, even though liberal egalitarians are, from the most part, pretty hostile to this flourishing view and insist on a neutrality perspective where the state is neutral about the good and gives people the means to pursue whatever ends they choose. In fact, we are quite accustomed to societies that aren't egalitarian enough, but nonetheless, they do certain things on the assumption that we can all agree this is good for you. So libraries lend books for free, for example. The arts are funded. We have parks, and if a developer wants to build something, they're usually told you got to have some green space with that. Why? Because we think green space is good for people. So we actually are much more prepared in the real world to think about these issues and are much less squeamish, I think, than the liberal egalitarian philosophies that we're inundated with. And sometimes I think we need to sort of step back from the ivory tower and think, hey, wait, are we not being kind of pushed along and kind of abstract theorizing that really doesn't connect with why these issues are important?
Yeah, so you raised the issue about neutrality here. That one view that like one reason I think that for some egalitarian philosophers to hold back from thinking that the thing that we should be the thing that we should be equalizing is everybody living a flourishing life is I mean, just to kind of spell out some of what you were getting, the concern that you were just addressing there, like that, I think like a really intuitive way of seeing why some people would hold back from that is saying, well, okay, this is what counts as a really good flourishing life. Says who, right? Like that, that gets to decide what counts as that. Different people have very different ideas about what counts as a good, as a good life. I mean, if you think about the sort of differences between what sort of religious ascetics, who might, live in a monastery, think of as a good life, and and other, more common ideas about that. There's a great diversity there, and people say that the state should be neutral in that. Then I think that there's this subsense in which we don't really I mean, like, we don't really want a state that's in the business of deciding what counts as a good life. We want people to be free to pursue their own vision of a good life. Now, I take your point that that's actually, that if you say it at that level of abstraction, everybody nods, or not everybody, there are all sorts of people who wouldn't, but like everybody within a certain range of political views maybe nods when you put it that way. But I do see your point that there are a lot of ways in which in practice this would be a much more extreme view than we think, because okay, do you not think that the state should be in the business of promoting reading and green space and and all those things? And I think that's a really fair point, but I did just want to push you on this a little bit. Is there like I mean, I assume you don't think that there's sort of nothing to neutrality worries, right? That we don't that there's nothing undesirable about a state sort of taking sides and like really fine-grained arguments about what counts as a good life. I mean, like, is there a kind of neutrality worth wanting, or not? Or if there is one, is it just that you think that there's no way that like the kind of neutrality that's worth wanting is like not so broad that it becomes a concern for this view that the state should be in the business of promoting equal flourishing?
Well, I think it has to be pluralistic. It's not that there's one answer to this question. There's a very wide range of valuable pursuits, and what's valuable for one person, particularly given their talents and aptitudes and interests, will be different from what's flourishing for another. So I think there's a lot of scope for diversity in this view. Certainly the idea of impartiality in the law is super important, and I think that's where we've gone wrong, what I call the juridicalization of politics, in that we've transplanted very important and valuable idea of equality before the law, the rule of law, that the law should treat us impartially, that the law applies to us all equally. That idea, and we're now thinking that it's the way to characterize politics more broadly. And I think it's worth noting that this is a fairly recent view. It's a kind of post-war view, coincides with the Cold War. But egalitarians earlier in this century and the previous century just took it as common sense that what egalitarianism was all about was trying to enable people to live equally good lives, as much as that is possible. Clearly, things like one's propensity to cheerfulness will have some impact on how happy or well you're living, but nonetheless, there's a lot more that we could do.
Counseling sessions to make you more cheerful.
Well, I think we do live in societies that are characterized by deep loneliness, that and poor mental health. I think that's an inequality too. Indeed, arguably, once you reach a certain kind of threshold of material well-being, those other things start to become much more important. And I think we need to think of it as part of the egalitarian project, not something separate from it.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, I wonder. I'm wondering about this neutrality worry, and I really like that last point about mental health. But I wonder how that worry would, like, if this is actually like a sort of particular problem for your view, or whether there are plausible things that could say about it sort of mirror what kind of any egalitarian has to say. In other words, that that anybody who thinks once you've decided what your answer is to the equality of what question, assuming that it's not such a minimalistic answer that like we already have it and just don't worry about it, like that you have that you've identified some really persistent source of inequality. There's going to have to be some sort of balancing of values, that the like nobody who if I give my sister a birthday present, I have perhaps slightly increased the amount of inequality in the world, because all the people who through no fault of their own, they didn't choose not to be my sister, they didn't get that present, but that's also fine, right? It's not objectionable for me to do that. And certainly you have certainly you have other values that like even when we start thinking about economic institutions, there's certainly values like efficiency that that can pull in the other direction. You quoted Marx earlier, from each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs. But of course, that you only get that in the upper phase of a communist society. Once you have material abundance, before then, he's willing to tie distribution to labor contributions, not because people particularly deserve it, but just as a way, just as an incentive, for greater economic output. And so I wonder how much of this neutrality concern could just be say, okay, look, we obviously value personal freedom, and when you start thinking about the state getting to decide what counts as a good life, I wonder how much of the pushback is just people who are sort of thinking about ways in which that could become intrusive, because it's the state is meddling too much in your lives, but how much you could just respond to that by saying, yeah, but I'm just talking about what's sort of desirable in terms of distributive, justice. Obviously, that has to be balanced against other considerations, like some reasonable degree of non-interference.
Yeah, certainly, of course. Yeah, it's not constant meddling. I mean, that's the sort of caricature that might be thrown my way, but I think that would be unreasonable. And as I say, we do actually take the view that there are things that the political community thinks are worthwhile, and we don't leave it to the market to decide whether or not they're available. We make sure they're available, and we have ways of incentivizing people's likelihood of taking them up. And so I think that's actually less problematic in many ways if we think about the real world. Municipalities are particularly interesting in terms of zoning and what is surprising, given that we think private property is this sort of sacred right. It's actually surprising how much municipalities, at least my side of the 49th parallel, maybe less so where you are, but we're used to municipalities telling you can't tear a building down because it's got a heritage designation, for example, or that you have to do, you can't go over this height, or that so there's lots of ways in which we think that cities have to be designed with human well-being in mind.
Yeah, even in the United States, there's plenty of that.
Yeah, I thought so.
Yeah. That's a big sort of subsection of arguments people have about making more housing available and stuff like that is exactly those sorts of considerations. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. Well, do you want to start taking questions?
Sure, good idea.
Great, thank you so much. I mean, there've been a number of questions coming in. I think it's fair to say that Debbie's question's already been answered, because I think she sent it before Ben brought up the issue of flourishing. So she was asking, how broad is your conception of flourishing? So I think that was definitely addressed. So there's a question that came in quite early on from Dave, who asks, should, in capital letters, there be, as opposed to is there, any relationship between outcomes and inputs, e.g. productive contribution? Mm. So Christine, do you want to go first? And then Ben, if you want to follow up or comment on this question at all, then please do so. Otherwise, we'll move to the next one.
Yeah, thanks. That's an excellent question. Very good, pointed way of putting the issue. I mean, these things will be context relative potentially, but there's certainly a whole swath of things that we just think that your contribution cannot determine how much you have in the way of healthcare or education or whatever, right? So that's why we have those are things that are publicly provided, and public goods are particularly valuable, right? It's goods that you get just by being a member of a society, being a member of a political community, rather than goods that have some kind of user paid dimension to them, or even a needs base. Sometimes we think that in order to meet people's needs adequately, we need to have goods that are provided to everyone, even those who privately could have afforded to get them for themselves. And that's a way of ensuring that everyone has the same level of need satisfaction, and that everyone's equally committed to the provision of those goods and so forth. So I would like to know what kind of context one thinks that one's input should determine how much one has. I guess my socialist inclinations tell on this, in that I think that people should have their needs met, and that's the criterion that we should be using, rather than how much they contribute. We could decide that we want to incentivize people, and that was certainly the kind of thing that Rawls said. But I think people to the left of Rawls said that, well, this was just a betrayal of the commitment to the egalitarian ideal, where it's arbitrary that some people are able to contribute more than others. That's a matter of brute luck or circumstance. Even the ability to work hard, one could argue, is something that we might not think is a matter of sort of moral merit. So I'm very reluctant to tie what one has to what one contributes.
Yeah, I mean, I do wonder, that if there is about that last distinction, because certainly, I mean, in a certain sense, I mean, again, I mean, Marx and the Critique of the Gotha program, where he says the thing about, from each core to your abilities to each core to your needs, is willing to accept, at least temporarily, some tying of outputs to inputs to incentivize production. Even G.A. Cohen, I think, read closely, like, sort of grudgingly accepts that, as a, I mean, of course, he's in the category of people you're criticizing, but, just as a person to the left of Rawls. But yeah, I mean, I think that, I guess I'm sort of inclined to be a little bit of a squishy centrist about this, to say that, like, on the one hand, I think that there is something that seems a bit less objectionable to me about inequality that is purely a matter of how much somebody chose to contribute. And I know that word "chose" is a minefield, but but at the same time, I mean, look, if you get to a point in terms of technological progress and the social institutions that you have governing how that the bounty of that progress is captured and distributed, where you don't have to tie outputs to inputs. I mean, that does seem like that. That does seem obviously more desirable to me. That if nobody is being hurt, if you're not having, the economy is not collapsing, etc., as a result of not having to tie these things together, then that does sound like a much better society to me.
Thank you. Christine, was there anything you wanted to respond to in Ben's point, or would you like to move on to the next question?
Yeah, no, I think we're kind of coming to some sort of agreement here. It's interesting that it was Stalin who said, "Those who do not work do not eat," and it seems a kind of sad comment that egalitarianism seems to be reduced to the terms of competition for scarce resources and positions. That just contrary to the spirit of solidarity and comradeship that I think egalitarianism really ought to be premised on.
Thank you. So Brooks asked a question which I think many people in Europe would probably resonate with. It's shock over certain patterns of behavior in the US. In this case, Brooke picks up on watching a PBS NewsHour coverage about school lunch issue in the US, when children who can't pay for their school meals are refused food in front of their better heeled comrades. What is the justification for this kind of discrimination, which seems so incredible to those of us who live in Europe? I remember thinking in a similar vein when I moved to the United States last year. My wife was trying to talk me through the ways in which the justifications for the healthcare system, as I suppose, have been brought up in a country that takes it for granted. And so I suppose maybe there are certain deeper assumptions or theories that are at play here, and I think Brooke wants to maybe understand how something like that can happen in a school in America.
Well, luckily I don't have to speak for America, nor does Ben for that matter. but here I am in Canada. It's unconscionable. There is no justification. Basically, I think. I mean, some idea that you're responsible for prudent management of the household budget and blah blah blah. But I think probably the strongest case for any egalitarian position is children, right? So we know that even like egalitarians, and John Romer says this very boldly, will say, well, of course, children are another case. We don't think children are making choices and decisions, with any kind of criterion of responsible, prudent decision making. That's just totally unjust to apply that any kind of luck egalitarian structure to the decision making of children. So whatever you think is the reason why adults are disadvantaged, it's unjust to apply it to children. So I think that, and that actually it's the idea of the injustice of being born to one family rather than another terms of socioeconomic status, but a whole bunch of things, whether they're good parents and so forth, whether they are sensible, practical, rational people, etc. That just makes it so vividly obvious that inequality is unfair. So I'm sympathetic to the tone of that question, which is basically that one cannot justify it.
Yeah, I mean, I actually remember growing up, I was certainly in a school district that didn't practice that particular kind of, hadn't entered the new frontier of social cruelty that the questioner is referring to, which I have heard about a bit, but the relatively far more benign thing that I remember is standing in line for school lunch and having them ask everybody, "Oh, are you on free or reduced lunch?" And so I guess, some people qualified for free school lunch or for like some sort of discount. And I remember even that used to really bother me because you're asking people to, to say publicly, like while they're in line and in front of their classmates, that what, essentially what their family's income level is, which seems sort of objectionable enough, in and of itself, and this is, I guess, maybe just to briefly tie it to larger questions at issue here. I mean, of course, this example, as you say, because it's about children, it's one where I think even people who feel the pull of saying, okay, adults can be held responsible for various decisions, whatever. It's even in those terms, you couldn't possibly justify this, but it's also, there is a sort of way that there is a slippery spectrum of indignities that are tied to this, that that even if they aren't necessarily about children directly. So I remember, for example, reading an essay, it was published after his death in Jacobin, called "The War of the Poor Must End," I think, by my late friend Michael Brooks, who was recounting going grocery shopping with his mom when she was using a SNAP card, which is what people are thinking of when they use the term food stamps, even though it's a card, and having her sort of like look both ways to see who was around and watching when she would pull it out, and being like very keenly aware of that as a little kid. So I mean, this is something that's, even things that don't directly target children, certainly children aren't immune from the parallel indignities, and this is, I think this is one reason why, one of the things that motivates the idea in the Cohen essay that Christine mentioned earlier, that, even if you think that sort of inequalities are only objectionably unjust in a certain way, if they're tied to things beyond your control, that, you'd also have something like a value of community, where you say, well, if people are within your sphere of concern, there's a certain level that you're not going to let them fall behind. I mean, any more than you would like let a member of your family fall below that level.
Thank you, Christine. Would you like to respond to anything Ben just said?
No, that's fine. Thanks.
Okay, so we're pretty close to the end. So I thought I'd ask you a question which I imagine would have a reasonably short answer to it. So Christine, well, thank you so much for your rich thoughts. Christine, do you feel, this is from Alice, by the way, do you feel that you need to underpin your ideas with a metaphysical picture related to free will, responsibility, etc., or can your political theory operate without this kind of foundational work?
That's a great question. Yeah, and I sort of say, well, let alone that morass over there on these questions, which certainly makes it a problem whether or not we freely choose the paths in life that we end up traversing. We can restrict our discussion to the political and say we know enough about the socioeconomic factors of what goes into why one person's life goes one way and another person's life goes another way, to problematize at least that distinction between choice and circumstance. And I guess we also just know in a sort of everyday, mundane, commonsensical way that some people just seem to know how to get to the door, know how to open it, know how to go from that door to another door that will be, and it will be there open for them, and others just don't seem to get it together to do that. And it seems wrong to think of that as a kind of culpability rather than something that society should try to attend to and remedy.
Thank you, Ben. I noticed something on your Substack when I was looking through it quite recently. It was called something like you can be a lefty while still believing in free will or something. So obviously you're kind of engaging with the free will question in the context of politics.
Yeah, that was called How to Be a Leftist Without Being a Utilitarian or a Free Will Skeptic. And I was right on the edge of thinking, it's like, maybe I said a lot of philosophy, maybe I should just refer people to the existence of that essay and leave it at that. But I guess maybe the one thing I would add is just that, I think there is a sort of certain way of accepting, like, that there's something desirable about not wanting to let your answers to these questions rest on sort of controversial, positions on deep and difficult questions like this. And I definitely see that impulse. I would point out that social change is really, really hard, and it takes a really long time, and that there are so many inequalities in the world around us that are so obviously and sort of uncontroversially tied to factors outside of our control that you could have you could spend quite a long time addressing all of those, and you'd have to create like a really unfathomably different sort of advanced socialist society just to address those. And before you were really faced with the question of, okay, what's left that plausibly might be seen as under anybody's control, and then we really have to answer this deep metaphysical question.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the same time, people, how one lives one's own life is obviously with a sense of taking charge of it. So there's a difference between a political outlook of generosity and fellow feeling and attending to the shortfalls and well-being of our fellows, and the way in which one ought to live one's life in terms of doing what you can to pursue your projects and goals and taking responsibility as best you can. That's just how to be a human, I think.